am the bureaucrat in the triangle of love that is the doctor, the bureaucrat, and the minimalist cat. We are a lesbian couple from Sydney, or we live in Sydney in Australia. We've been married a few months, but we've been together for about 13 years. And we are in the process of trying to have our first child. But we're also doing a series on mental health because my wife, the doctor, has been diagnosed with a couple of mental health disorders, and that has been a big part of our life, the cat is here. So basically my role in this series is to talk about what it's like to care for someone with mental health issues. Being that person, being the carer, was without doubt the most difficult thing I've ever done. And there were things that I did that made it harder, and there were things that I did eventually that made it easier. But if you want to hear the doctor story, then I'll put the link to that video in the down. Now, when I first met my wife, she was 18 and I was 22, and just gradually over time, the mental health problems that my wife struggled with became more and more intense, and taking care of her became a bigger and bigger part of my life, and also a bigger and bigger part of our relationship. When you're in that really acute time, it is really hard. When we realized that she was really, really unwell, it was horrible, and it got worse and worse. I think the most debilitating thing about it, probably, is that when you care for someone, it's because you love them. And so caring for them is when they're unwell, when they're suffering. It's so hard. It's hard to watch someone that you love suffer. You watch them suffer, you can't help them, you can't fix it, you can't change it, you can't solve it. You are just helpless. And all the fear and the loneliness and the terror that goes with being unwell and not knowing what's going to happen to you and not knowing if you're going to be okay, that's really, really hard. On a different level, it's painful because when someone is unwell, they are an asshole mostly. When someone has a mental health problem, that usually makes them much less nice. It makes you different. It makes you not who you normally would be, and that's hard. That's really hard to cope with. But also it can make people really horrible. The first signs that my wife was really unwell was that she was really irritable and really impatient, really short with me, really cross with me, really unkind to me. And that was really what triggered her to go and get help in the first place. But it also makes, like, people who have anxiety disorders, for example, which my wife does, are really, really indecisive, like to the ridiculous nth degree, and they procrastinate and they can't cope with anything, and you're the one who has to like do everything because they can't cope with anything, and that's really frustrating. When people have depression, their whole focus is just on them and their world, and then when they get really, really sick, they just disappear. And that is maybe the worst part. They're just so unavailable, so utterly unavailable, and the person that you would rely on cannot be there for you. So it's horrible because it can really wreck your relationship. And the combination, watching my wife suffer damaged me in some deep place that I'm not sure I will ever be able to recover. But also the difficulty and how much she changed, that did damage our relationship. I guess the other thing which I've kind of alluded to is that when you are caring for someone with a mental illness, my experience was that you are very isolated. I felt incredibly isolated. Part of why I wanted to make this video was because I spent a lot, and Googling is my superpower, I tell you. And I spent a lot of time Googling, trying to find like resources and online forums and chat rooms. But anyway, I felt really alone for 3 reasons. The first reason was I promised my wife that I wouldn't tell anyone. She was ashamed and she didn't want people to know. She thought people would think badly of her. So she made me promise that I wouldn't tell. And I kept that promise. I wish I hadn't. I shouldn't have. It wasn't right. I didn't tell because I didn't want people to think badly of her. Like the people, I couldn't talk to her family because she made me promise I wouldn't. But I also couldn't talk to my family because I didn't want them to think badly of her. And I don't know why I would think they would, but that's what I was scared of. And I think the third reason is that we were in the closet. And when you're in the closet, you really have to isolate yourself. That is the nature of the closet. You're behind a door and you can't let people see the intimate details of your life, because you might accidentally let something slip, or they might put two and two together, they might guess. So we were already isolated from our friends, and this further isolated us, because I definitely couldn't tell like the extent to which I was taking care of her, because they might have thought that was weird. So for all those reasons, I didn't talk about it. I felt I couldn't talk about it. I was so horribly alone. It was the worst thing. It was to feel so alone and to feel I'll always be alone. But we moved on, and gradually she got better, and then oddly enough things got worse for me in some ways.